I'm Anja Manuel, the Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum, and we're very lucky and honored to have with us today Bob Gates, who has run many large organizations in his life and reformed almost all of them, from the CIA to Texas A&M to, most importantly, the U.S. Department of Defense. And we here at the Aspen Security Forum thought, since there's been so much conversation around reforming government, making government more streamlined, it would be really important to get Secretary Gates' perspective on exactly this. Bob, you wrote some of this down in your fantastic book, Duty. I have my earmarked copy right here. It's disappearing. But you really did a huge amount to reform the Pentagon, which is a notoriously difficult agency to reform. I think you cut over $100 billion in overhead costs over your time there. And you did it all not by imposing it by fiat, but telling the services that the money they saved in overhead costs would be invested in more military capabilities, and so getting their buy-in. Could you just describe a little bit more about the process you used and how successful it was?
Sure, Anja, I'm happy to be with you. So my time as secretary under President Bush was actually spent trying to get the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in a better place. But when President Obama asked me to stay on, I decided that the agenda for my work there would be really more focused on the Pentagon itself. And we actually did two tranches of cuts, one in 2009 and one in 2010. In 2009, we cut 36 legacy programs that, had they been built to completion, would have cost the taxpayers about $330 billion. And most of my predecessors, if they were lucky, cut one or two of these big programs. And the services would go around them to the Hill, and the Hill was protecting a lot of these systems and so on. And by including the service chiefs and the combatant commanders and the senior civilians in the decision-making process, we were able to identify these programs that, frankly, were either no longer valid. There was no longer a requirement. They weren't working. We had one program we cut was a missile defense program that was was in the 14th year of a 5-year development program. The $1 billion presidential helicopter. And there were like 36 of these, and some of them were caps, and some of them were getting rid of the programs altogether. So that was the first, and that was focused on legacy programs. Then in the spring of 2010, and I should say that effort came as a result of probably 40 or 50 meetings over the course of 3 months with the leadership of the Pentagon, both civilian and military. The next year, we decided to tackle overhead.
Can I just pause you? Sorry, can I pause you there? Because that's really important, because really, when you look at the $850 billion Pentagon budget, there's overhead that could be cut, but the programs are really, frankly, I would say, even more difficult because so many members of Congress have their specific programs that they love and they're in their districts. How did you work with Congress on making that piece of it happen?
Well, there were some of those programs that actually went to a vote in Congress, capping the F-22, for example. And John McCain was a big supporter and a big help to me in that regard. And the F-22 had contracts in 44 states. That's 88 senators. Right. And so, the Air Force is still mad at me for capping that, although I was the only secretary never to actually cut the program from when it was started. But we were able, frankly, part of it was surprising the Congress and presenting all of these programs at once. Because when there's just one or two programs on the block, then people can do deals on the Hill. If you'll protect this program that's in my district or my state, I'll help you on something else later. And when you present a whole bunch of these that affect a lot of different members of Congress, and you basically surprise them. I announced it. I announced all these cuts while they were on a 2-week recess. So I had a lot of help from the press, frankly, in highlighting the specifics of these cuts that made it very difficult for members of Congress to defend keeping those programs. So part of it's tactics, political tactics. Part of it is getting congressional allies for certain programs and so on.
Yeah.
The second
The shock
year,
and awe point is really important. Got to do it all at once.
yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
The second tranche in 2010 was cutting overhead. And ultimately, we ended up identifying $180 billion in overhead cuts, $100 billion from the services and $80 billion from the department itself.
Wow. Bob, can I stop you? Over how many years is that?
This is over about
180
5.
billion in savings.
All of these programs, for example, the 330 was the length of those programs. So had they been built to completion, that's where the 330 billion comes from. In the case of the overhead, it was depending on the cuts, it was anywhere from right away to 5 years to 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
And of that 180, 100 was assigned to the services, and that's the part that you described, where with the agreement of the president and the director of OMB, I cut a deal with the services that said, first of all, you have to identify the cuts. Then once the cuts have been identified and put into the program, then we will revisit. And if you can identify weapons programs that give us actual military capability, you probably will give you some of the money back. And that was a big incentive for the services. And so literally over a 2-year period, we identified about $500 billion in cuts that ended up getting congressional support and went forward. And so it was and the efficiencies, the overhead cuts were also the product of 30 to 40 meetings that I had with all the leaders of the services. And they helped identify a lot of these opportunities. The program evaluation group, CAPE in the Department of Defense, cost analysis and program evaluation people teed up a lot of programs that weren't performing up to par, and we had a lot of discussions over that. I made a lot of time for the service chiefs to come in and defend programs that they wanted to keep. One of the areas that was a target-rich environment, frankly, were programs that members of Congress wanted in the budget, but that the services actually didn't want or need. For example, members of Congress wanted to keep building Humvees, and the Army said, we don't want any more of these. And so that was another source of how we did it. So, but the bottom line is I didn't have a single resignation, either military or civilian. And people really thought that, I mean, some of the things that we cut, in all honesty, as I put it in the book, just didn't pass the giggle test. One of the programs we cut was an airborne chemical laser. It was going to be placed mounted in the platform was a 747 aircraft. And there was only one problem with the chemical laser. It only had a range of 60 miles. So you basically had to orbit a 747 over the test ranges in Iran or North Korea or Russia or China for it to be any good. And every plane was $1 billion with $100 million a year operating costs. So, you can get to some pretty significant numbers if you bring forward evidence like that.
Yeah. Can I double down a little bit on your cutting of overhead costs? Because that's really hard too, and has a real chance to impact morale more than, frankly, weapons programs cuts, because it impacts people. People may have to be let go at some point. Did you tell all parts of the Pentagon that they had to cut 10, 20%? Were there more cuts in some departments rather than others? How did you go about deciding where and who to cut?
Well, first of all, and this is a lesson that I would offer for the new administration, across the board percentage cuts, I have believed for decades, are managerial cowardice. because that means you're cutting the most important things you do at the same level as the least important things you do. It's a stupid way to cut the budget. And so what we did was partly we looked at staff. So we eliminated, this is the first time, for the first time ever, we eliminated a combatant command. We eliminated the Joint Forces Command in Norfolk. In fact, that was the first major four-star appointment I gave to Jim Mattis. Go down and dismantle JIFCOM. And so we dismantled that. A lot of it was cutting staffs, and these things can be done easily by attrition because there's such a high turnover on staffs and I'm talking about commander staffs and things like that, and that you can do it really without much pain and without firing people. So I think that we were able to do it in a way, and we got rid of some functions that we thought could be either pared back or eliminated. And this was another place where, particularly when it came to the services, I gave them a lot of freedom to decide what they wanted to do. So the services themselves came up with the cuts that got them to the numbers that the goals that I put in front of them.
Bob, did you actually reduce headcount? Like, did people have to be let go? Or when you're saying it happened by attrition, you just wouldn't hire new people? There'd be fewer billets.
I think in the case of military people, the idea was not to cut people. For people who were in uniform, the idea was, how do you put them someplace where they can do more good than where they are right now, where they can make a more positive impact? So if you're cutting staffs, for example, and this is something a lot of people don't think about, you automatically reduce the size of a staff if you change the rank of a commander from a 4-star to a 3-star.
Right.
It's just a fact of life. And so we downgraded a number of positions, general officer positions, and we reduced the number of general officers across the board. And again, this was something taking place over a period of time, so that there really was not very much human pain involved.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it was important that you've said several times, you chaired 60 meetings, you chaired 40 to 50 meetings. Do you think it's possible to do this from the outside, like in a way that DOGE is attempting to do this time?
I think in a way what DOGE could do is what cost analysis and program evaluation did for me. I think they can collect ideas, collect proposals, collect ways to go about cutting overhead and so on, that then can be presented to the Secretary of Defense or to the administration, to OMB, as an agenda that basically says, this is a target-rich environment, and here are the targets that we've identified. And I think there are a lot of ways they can collect those ideas and put them on the table. They can't implement anything as an outside commission. So the first thing they have to do is make sure that they and the Secretary of Defense and the Director of OMB are all on the same page, and that the Secretary of Defense is going to aggressively pursue the ideas that they have put forward.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Let me just, as I said in the beginning, we had Vivek Ramaswamy on stage with us last week at Aspen. I know you weren't able to be there. He gave some pretty thoughtful and detailed remarks for what they're planning and how they're thinking through this. And he also said one of the things that's been encouraging, said Ramaswamy, is how nonpartisan and apolitical the interest in this mission has been. And I think that's true, especially because they're talking about efficiency in the government overall, and not, as some people were afraid of, all the agencies except DOD, which has one of the largest budgets. They talked a lot about starting with technology to identify fraud, waste, and abuse. That's a target-rich environment. But then some of the deeper ones will probably get political, whether they're bipartisan or not. You, over your career, have a huge reputation for bipartisanship. Do you have advice for them in how to keep it apolitical?
Sure. For one thing, again, if their whole purpose is to gather and create a menu of places where cost and people can be reduced or cut, then one of their potential allies are members of Congress, both on the left and on the right. They're going to have a different set of proposed cuts in the defense budget. But if you take them both, then you increase the list that you've got to look at in terms of what your options are for cutting the budget. And it also communicates that this is, in fact, a nonpartisan or bipartisan kind of effort. I mean, everybody, you know, nobody is against cutting waste in the government. And let me just say, for the record, waste, fraud, and abuse is a favorite saying for everybody. The truth is, fraud and abuse are very rare. And when they're identified, people go to prison. We've done this. The real problem is waste and inefficiency. Those are that's where you're going to find the targets. That's where the money is. That's where the people are. And so sort of presenting it as fraud and abuse, that's, in terms of dollars, that's trivial, and the people who are responsible go to jail or get fired. So focusing on waste is really what it's all about. And I would say my advice would be, don't start with how many people I'm going to cut. The truth is, personnel costs are a trivial part of the potential for reducing overhead. You start with programs, just as we did with the legacy programs, the 36 legacy programs. Start with programs that aren't working, or programs that maybe shouldn't exist anymore. And when you identify the programs to be eliminated, personnel reductions will follow behind that as a consequence of cutting something the government ought not be doing, the Department of Defense ought not be doing, or is doing all wrong.
Right. That's actually quite similar to something Vivek said. He approached it more from a conservative viewpoint. There are lots of regulations out there that probably are at the limits of what's constitutionally permissible, or the way he would put it, unconstitutional. And if we stop enforcing those regulations, there are fewer people that are needed to do that. He also was, I thought, quite moderate in his response to how personnel reduction would happen, saying, you'd give people severance pay, you'd do retraining, all positive. Let me give you some other things to react to. For example, one of the things that was raised last week was a favorite of conservatives, which is possible area for cost cut includes the U.S. foreign assistance budget. And you've written a lot about this with your Symphony of Power. I just looked it up before we got on the Zoom here. And the U.S. foreign assistance request for next year, for 2025, was $42 billion, versus the Department of Defense budget request was $850 billion. How do you feel about cuts to foreign assistance?
Well, first of all, I think for decades, foreign assistance has been the least popular government program in the international arena. Everybody rails against foreign assistance, foreign aid. The thing that I think people have to come back to is we are in, and this is a place where the administration, I think, is going to be taking a very strong position, and that is on this relationship, this competition with China. Belt and Road has 150 countries that have signed up to Belt and Road projects. That's foreign assistance. That's development assistance by the Chinese. Now, it involves a lot of debt, a lot of white elephant projects. We all know all the problems with Belt and Road. But the fact is 150 countries are partnered. If we are going to compete with the Chinese for influence, for markets, and power in the global South, we can't just ignore the role of Belt and Road and the foreign assistance programs and development assistance programs the Chinese have offered. There's a lot of room for improvement in the way we do that. And frankly, the first Trump administration took an important step in that direction when they abolished the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and replaced it with the Development Assistance or the Development Finance organization, and they doubled the capital from 30 billion to 60 billion for that kind of investment. So figuring out how to do development assistance smart, where there's accountability, where we can see progress, where we play to our strengths. We can't compete with China in building highways and building sports arenas and railroads and so on, but we can compete when it comes to education, to healthcare, to governance, and a whole host of areas that are actually pretty cost effective. And Colombia may be the best example. I'll give you two examples of where foreign assistance paid enormous dividends for the United States. Colombia back in the 80s was on the verge of becoming a narco state run by narco terrorists. And Plan Colombia, that was supported by both Democrats and Republicans, that had the State Department in the lead and had Justice Department helping train judges and so on and so forth, prevented, and with a very modest U.S. defense component, at the most there were 800 U.S. troops on the ground in Colombia. But it may not have stopped the drug trade, but it kept Colombia from becoming a narco state. The other program that has paid us enormous dividends over the last 3 decades was President Bush's program for the emergency AIDS program in Africa that saved probably 30 million lives. It won us huge benefits in Africa. So figuring out how to do development assistance smart is a critical component of our arsenal of how we're going to deal with China, particularly in the global South. The reality is, just like in the Cold War, if we're able to avoid a military confrontation with China, this competition will be resolved through non-military instruments of power. Our economy, technology limitations on exports and so on, and development assistance, strategic communications, these are the components of those non-military tools. And if you're going to do everything you can to prevent a military confrontation, that's where this competition is going to be fought. And why would we tie one hand behind our back?
That's a very good point. I would add to that list the Millennium Challenge account, which actually is foreign aid that goes to countries that are doing the right thing, sort of pulls them up rather than throwing, quote, good money after bad.
Well, and Millennium Challenge Corporation also insists on measures of accountability and local responsibility. It empowers our embassies, but it also empowers local governments and then holds them accountable. So it's a great model that conservatives, back when President Bush created the MCC, that a lot of conservatives wanted to get rid of all of our development assistance, USAID, and put it all under Millennium Challenge because of the accountability and so on. That didn't happen, but it is a testimony to the efficacy of the program.
So it sounds like in your symphony of power, you've described, you wouldn't necessarily cut foreign assistance, you would just use it more wisely. I think that's a fair summary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you say a little bit more also about other areas? I'm trying to get kind of we see this from a national security perspective. Of course, the Pentagon is the biggest part of that budget, the intel communities, but then there is also this symphony of power. We've talked about foreign aid. Say a little bit more about what you mean by messaging and communications, because you were really part of the CIA when we did that extraordinarily well. And
it was a huge component of our strategy against the Soviet Union. And frankly, we don't do it very well or very much now. USIA was abolished by the Congress in 1998. Global diplomacy was media diplomacy and so on was tucked away into a corner of the State Department, now run by an undersecretary, a fraction the size of USIA. And we had radios all over the world. We had we smuggled materials in to the Soviet Union the way we ought to be doing it in Russia and Iran and North Korea and so on now, in China. And China today, Hu Jintao invested $7 billion in creating a global communications capability for China. There's not a country on the planet where you can't access Chinese internet, Chinese social media, Chinese news, Chinese newspapers, Chinese television, Chinese radio. We don't have anything like that. We do have our radios, Voice of America and so on, but they're very limited. We used to have a USIA library in every major city in the developing world. And we trained a lot of leaders. We had a lot of exchanges, and we just don't have the programs we have along these lines are very, very limited right now. And so, this is the country that invented public relations, and we're doing it very poorly in communicating our message to the rest of the world about what we're all about and our values and so on. And if you're going to have this competition with China is the centerpiece of our national security challenge going forward, then the ability to communicate to the rest of the world why our system works and theirs doesn't, and what they're doing internally. I mean, just imagine a program that communicates to the Iranian people how much money their government is wasting supporting the Houthis and Hezbollah and so on, that makes the lives of people in Iran miserable because all the money's going somewhere else. So we just don't do a very good job of that. And if we're going to compete with China, we'd better enhance those capabilities.
And by the way, our adversaries do a great job with that. And because of social media, cyber intrusions, other technologies, it's so much less expensive and you can have a much farther reach than you did before.
Well, and my attitude, and maybe this is the old CIA guy in me, but the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians are so messing with us internally in terms of messaging and disinformation, misinformation, fake things, and so on and so forth. Why aren't we doing that to them? Why aren't we interfering? Why aren't we using our own cyber channels to create these channels of information? But in our case, just like in the Cold War, the benefit of our communications is we can just tell the truth about what they're doing, and it's enormously effective.
Right. As you said in the beginning, that's a target-rich environment for spending the money that we're already spending on these efforts far more efficiently.
The example here, and it's true in development assistance also, in the case of strategic communications, we have 13 cabinet departments and 48 agencies all doing some kind of strategic communications internationally. And there's no coordinating of those efforts at all.
That's great. Let me maybe close with one final question. You said in duty that one of the things that you tried to change in the culture of the Pentagon is getting good ideas up from the bottom to the ranks and through the bureaucracy to people who could actually do something about them. Do you have any advice for DOGE and their effort in how to do that effectively?
Well, I think a lot of it is first of all, using the power of the Secretary of Defense to make clear through the ranks that ideas on how to do things better and smarter, no matter what level, are welcome. My experience has been people on the front lines, and this is true whether it's faculty at a university, faculty and staff at a university, the spies and analysts at CIA, or the troops in the Pentagon. People on the front, and I would add, having been a member of a lot of boards of directors, it's true in business as well. People on the front lines often have a better understanding of what's not working and better ways to do things, often more efficient and less costly than people sitting in the C-suite or in the E-ring, and figuring out ways to open those channels of communication, that those kinds of views are welcome, and that toxic leaders who suppress those views should find it not career enhancing. There should be, when I was secretary, every time I went to Iraq and Afghanistan, my whole purpose was to visit the troops. And I found out stuff that was going on that I would never have known about had I stayed in Washington. And I was getting it from colonels down to corporals. And the same thing is true inside the Pentagon, and creating those channels, visiting people in their own working spaces, visibility. And the other thing you can do where the word gets around is if somebody comes up with a great idea, or somebody challenges the boss and the boss says, I was wrong and you were right. If you publicize those things inside the Pentagon, that it's career enhancing to come forward with great ideas, new ideas, criticisms of how things are being done, just like telling the boss that he's wrong. That gets around. I had an Army 4-star, actually the Army service, the Chief of Staff of the Army. I made a decision in terms of who to appoint to a senior command position. He came in, convinced me to do something else, and I made it very public around the Department of Defense, and I used it in every public remarks that I made, highlighting what he had done and the fact that it was career enhancing to challenge and to make to make a suggestion to counter influence the boss, and just creating an environment where people feel more at liberty to do that is a very tough challenge. I don't underestimate it at all. Most bosses say they want that and then don't do it. But creating that environment is critically important, because those people often are going to be your best sources of information and give you leads to things that may seem small at one point, but then all of a sudden you realize, actually, this represents a huge problem, and I've got a big opportunity to make a change here.
I lifted the rock and found the toad.
Exactly.
Exactly. Well, that's really great advice. And it sounds like you think there's no substitute for having the leadership within each agency that's going to make the change. So an outside commission like DOGE can make a lot of great suggestions, but ultimately it comes down to pushing it through at the individual agency.
Well, and based on what I've read, Anja, they understand that. They know that they're an outside. They have no line authority. But if they're making these proposals available to both, let's say, the Secretary of Defense and the Director of OMB, then the likelihood, and given the President's determination that this effort be successful, the President-elect's determination that it be successful, then I think you create the kind of power structure that empowers the Secretary of Defense and OMB to actually affect many of the suggestions that are being made.
Right. Thank you. Any final words of advice?
Well, I'd go back to reemphasize an aspect of what I just said. The role of the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense will be very critical in this effort. They have to be the allies. When I was the one that pushed these efforts to get rid of the legacy programs and to cut the overhead, almost $500 billion back in the 2010s, and so there has to be strong leadership, and people have to understand there are consequences for not taking these efforts seriously. Over time, I relieved 2 service secretaries. I relieved a commander in the field. I relieved several generals, and you have to hold people accountable. So if you tell them you're going to go do this, and they don't take it seriously or they don't do it, that's the opportunity then to make a change. And it basically illustrates that the person in charge is not just kind of surfing the surface, but is actually getting down to the nuts and bolts.
On top of the organization. Right. Exactly. Thank you, Bob. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and advice. You're one of the few leaders that's really done this at scale. And so we're really glad to have you talking about it on our platform. Thanks for
happy to do it.